Yes.
You shouldn't call me that. The blade game, huh, Buzz? I thought only punks fought with knives.
Well, who's fighting? I'm fighting. It's examination time, man. It's a crazy game. Now, you understand the action. Now, there's no sticking. Crunch. Just a little jabbing. That's all. Well, now, you crud chicken. Now, you call me that.
Games and rituals, with the very real possibility of serious injury and even death, with as much public attention as possible in order to show to the world that they were tough, brave, ruthless, and bad enough to earn the respect and attention many of these boys craved, perhaps subconsciously and often lacked, at home. The 1950s press, in its effort to keep the public informed, while making a profit, of course, gave these boys the perverse notoriety that some of them wanted, and often on a national scale. There was the Civic Center shooter, 19-year-old San Francisco gang leader Robert Arthur Ransom, who proved just how bad he was when, just past midnight on March 30, 1952, he gained national notoriety when he agreed to meet 19-year-old Norman Botello for a fistfight near a water fountain after the Butcher's Ball dance party, then pulled a .45 caliber pistol, gunning down Botello, as well as fellow teen gangster Andrew Ulibarri, for which he would serve 2 decades in the California penal system for this one night of ego protection with a gun. There was Clement Cookie Massis, a 14-year-old Chicago boy who was so anxious to prove to his gang that he was ruthless that he ignored their instructions not to go in armed when they trapped 17-year-old Kenneth Sloboda with a car in a revenge raid July 2nd, 1955. Sloboda was gunned down with a shotgun, for which Massis, who actually joined the U.S. paratroopers earlier that year, would serve time for over a decade after his conviction. His stylish pompadour hairstyle would be shaved bald while in prison. During his trial, Massis claimed that his shooting of Sloboda was an accident. Another boy who claimed that it was an accident, while admitting to shooting a gang rival that same year, was 17-year-old Frank Santana. He was charged for the April 30, 1955 shooting murder of 15-year-old William Blanksenship. Though Santana claimed to the court that it was an accident, that didn't stop him from waving his hands and smiling to his gang admirers as he was being hauled into court for the murder trial. According to press reports, Santana either wanted to be referred to as Tarzan, after Edgar Rice Burroughs' iconic ape-man of novels and film fame, or Taza, the son of Cochise, portrayed by actor Rock Hudson in the 1954 Western of the same name. The press obliged Santana with both monikers, even as the 17-year-old convicted gang shooter was sentenced on July 15th, 1955, less than 2 weeks after 14-year-old Clement Cookie Massis was sentenced over in Chicago. Tarzan, or Taza Santana, received 25 years to life in a Bronx County court for the murder of the 15-year-old high school football star Blanksenship, the victim himself, it turns out, being a gang leader as well. A detail of the case that brought much heartbreak to Blanksenship's father, who felt betrayed by the New York district attorney, who in fact brought out that detail, seemingly doing Taza Santana's defense attorney's job for him. There were many, too many young boys on the verge of manhood who unfortunately gained the national notoriety that they perhaps thought that they wanted, claiming to their court-appointed psychiatrists, defense attorneys, and the press that they didn't receive such attention at home. They gained that notorious attention through armed violence, either through a gun or a knife, throughout the 1950s decade, though of course such incidents are nostalgically forgotten or denied today. However, the 1955 conviction of 17-year-old Frank Santana brought up debates regarding poverty, mental health issues, and one other aspect that made it unique: racial prejudice, since unlike Ransom, Massis, or many of the other 1950s convicted teen gunmen who were of European extraction, white, Santana was Puerto Rican. Another 1950s example of a teenage gang leader convicted of a homicide, that of 16-year-old Salvador Agron, brought up similar debates in the 1950s press along the lines of the Santana case in 1955. Agron, known as the Cape Man in the press, was also Puerto Rican. Agron's conviction for the August 30, 1959 Hell's Kitchen murders of two 16-year-olds is especially relevant, as though unrelated to the Manhattan Lower East Side gang war, occurred within the same time span as that tragedy, the main focus of this study. Author Richard Jacoby, who spent several years corresponding with Agron, gives insight on that separate, unrelated, yet close in timeline case out of Hell's Kitchen of the summer of 1959.
The letter I would like to read is something that Salvador Agron wrote to me about his experience and what he was called or named in the beginning. And here it is. I was a semi-illiterate kid of 16 years of age, with the mentality of a 12-year-old in 1959, when I was in a gang fight in Hell's Kitchen that left two Anglo-Saxon American kids of 16 dead and one severely wounded. I was a member of a teenage gang called the Vampires. I wore a black cape and carried a Mexican dagger. I was young and ignorant. I had an umbrella, which I gave to Tony Hernandez, and he gave me his black cape with a red satin lining. Weapons were given out, and I chose a Mexican dagger. This had belonged to our president, Manny Ortega. Same dagger used when we took our oath months ago in Central Park. It was an oath taken underneath the full moon, and so named our gang the Vampires. The oath was taken by lifting the dagger up to the moon and swearing that we would, from that day onward, defend one another as brother and fellow vampires. When I was arrested, I told a reporter, I don't care if I burn, my mother can watch. And that statement alone was really electric at that time. And I think the media that night, they were pushing him, and they were interrogating him, and it was bravado.
At the time that Agron had been arrested and booked and tried, the incident occurred on August 30, 1959. I believe he was arrested in September, correct?
Right, exactly.
That incident occurred just 1 week after the completely unrelated and yet similar incident across town in Manhattan's Lower East Side. Teresa G, she was gunned down. Manuel Cintron was gunned down. And that was just 1 week earlier. That was also around the time that 19-year-old Charles Starkweather, again, completely unrelated, but he was already being sentenced to death in 1959, around the same time that Salvador Agron was being booked. And then, of course, in Jasper, Alabama, there was a teenage boy who had assaulted the wife of his teacher. That was also around the same time. All of that was in the press. Do you feel, your opinion now, this is an opinion, do you feel all of that regarding juvenile delinquency would have affected the trial, the case of Salvador Agron?
It's hard to know for sure, but I would speculate that yes, it did, because there was enough media attention to his case at the time. I can't see how a jury would go home and not listen to other news and be affected by that too. At one point, I did make the acquaintance of Martin Sheen, and I had shown him some of my writing, and we got into a discussion. It was very brief about Carolyn Fugate, and the discussion had started because I asked him about the movie, and I told him the work I was doing and all of this sort of thing. And it was a very different person when he talked about her, and he was very honest in his feelings and all of that, but you really didn't get the impression that the little media I had read about her said that, she was wild, she was this and all of that. She was fine from what he said, or at least the image was very different. Any kind of trial had to have an effect on other people. Because again, they go home at night unless they're sequestered, which this jury I don't think was, and they hear things. And again, there was a very hostile atmosphere in New York City against Puerto Ricans. They were at the time considered the invaders, and they were considered the people who were immigrating to New York, and no one wanted them around. So here they had Salvador Agron to, throw their venom at. So yeah, I do. I can't say for sure, obviously, and it is my opinion, but I think it did have an effect. Yeah.
Into this world of protection and projection of rep, which included the claiming of girls as possessions, both of which were at the heart of 1950s youth gang conflicts, came the youth outreach worker. More often than not, these were men of religious conviction who saw the reduction of gang violence as their religious calling from God himself. Most of them were well aware that playing into these boys' egos and need for self-importance was the key to turning them away from violence. These boys, for reasons already discussed, needed to feel important, and the gang outreach worker provided that. There was the Reverend Ben Mooring, who combined military drill, martial arts instruction, and theatrical training for his Centurions program. Members of his outreach would not only perform in his original musical stage plays, often sprinkling in doses of fight scene choreography, courtesy of Mooring's expertise in the art of judo, but director John Frankenheimer would tap Mooring for recruits as extras to lend authenticity for his adaptation of Evan Hunter's 1959 urban crime novel, A Matter of Conviction, itself inspired by the Michael Farmer case. Filming would begin in 1960 under a different title, The Young Savages, starring Burt Lancaster as the prosecuting district attorney. There was the country preacher, David Wilkerson, who upon reading a 1958 Life magazine article on the trial of the Egyptian kings for the murder of Michael Farmer, would actually interrupt the court proceedings, claiming that he had dozens of teenagers in his flock praying for the souls of those on trial. He would, of course, be escorted out of the court, but he would later work with the Mau Maus of Fort Greene, who gained notoriety in 1959 for the shooting murder of 17-year-old gang rival Anthony Lavancino. Wilkerson's efforts would be preserved in the book and the stage play, The Cross and the Switchblade, with the 1970 film adaptation starring former 50s clean teen icon Pat Boone in the role of Wilkerson. There was Youth for Service, whose initial successes at least would be compared and contrasted in the press of 1959 as a simplified narrative of what San Francisco was supposedly doing right with their youth gang problems as opposed to New York's. Youth for Service's work would live on in the 1961 educational film Ask Me, Don't Tell Me, which itself is often used today as source footage for actual 1950s and early 60s teenage gangs in various documentaries. The New York City Youth Board would also be covered in the 1950s press for their outreach program of turning fighting gangs into social clubs. The Wasted Years by Jess Stern and All the Way Down by former pro boxer Vincent Riccio chronicled their efforts. Among the youth board's workers included baseball legend Joe DiMaggio, who actually suffered an assault with a pool cue from one of his teenage charges during his early work with the youth board, at least according to Vincent Riccio. The board itself would live on today in pop culture as a throwaway line in the 1961 film adaptation of the 1957 Broadway stage play West Side Story.
Me and Tony started the jet.
So where is he?
How come he takes a lousy stinking job?
The youth board corrupted him.
And then there was the Reverend Chauncey Kilmer Myers of Manhattan's Lower East Side. His Lower East Side Neighborhood Association was the focal point of his own memoirs, Light Dark Streets, published in 1957, 2 years after he had established a formal peace treaty between opposing gang factions in 1955, covered by the press. Perhaps Myers' approach of treating youth gangs as sovereign nations, thus giving these boys the importance and recognition they seemed to need, was natural. Born in February of 1916, a New York native, Myers' later career as the Bishop of the Diocese of California of the Episcopal Church during the 1960s saw him both publicly in opposition to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, in support of the Civil Rights Movement, along with many other progressive political stances, though curiously, initially Myers was opposed to the ordaining of women, a stance that he would later somewhat retract by giving support to the 1976 General Convention, which itself supported the ordaining of women. An alumnus of Rutgers, he earned his BA in sociology and would later be awarded an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree from Rutgers. His lifelong marriage to Katie Lee Stewart would include a multiracial family through adoption. This overview of Myers' life and progressive political stance reflected his approach to 1950s youth gang outreach in Manhattan's Lower East Side. Myers was also keenly aware of the changing ethnic makeup of the Lower East Side in the years following the end of World War II. The descendants of Eastern European Jews who had immigrated to the Lower East Side in order to escape pogroms of late 19th century Europe were leaving the neighborhood as African Americans, themselves escaping Jim Crow segregation in the Deep South to work in the munitions plants of World War II, were gradually replacing them. Following them were Puerto Rican migrant families seeking better job opportunities as their island, a colony of the United States seized following the end of the Spanish-American War of the late 19th century, changed its economic model from agriculture based on sugar plantations to factory-based U.S. industries, with the majority of the profits going to a select few Puerto Rican elites and the mainland U.S. corporations and magnates who owned both them and the factories, all without the power of the vote or representation, as Puerto Rico was and is a possession of the United States, a colony and not a state. The majority of the work on the island was on the backs of Puerto Rican labor, who, like the black families in the American South, wanted a better life for their own families. Like many situations throughout the history of human migrations, the differing ethnic groups often saw each other not as fellow human beings in a shared or relatable struggle, but rather as competitors or even obstacles and invaders. The remaining ethnic whites, Italians, Irish, Eastern Europeans, and Jewish, the relatively recent African Americans, and Puerto Ricans, all of whom were vying for jobs that had been reduced with the closure of munitions plants as World War II ended, often referred to each other in less than tolerable terms. And those attitudes often were passed on to their children, the working class teenagers of the 1950s inner cities, who enacted their own form of war games based on unofficial territories or turf. If peace was to be had between these new warring factions of teenagers, Kilmer Myers reasoned that he would have to acknowledge the legitimacy of these boys' worldview. Myers' first peace treaty that he arranged between two warring gangs, the Dragons, a primarily Puerto Rican youth gang, and the Sportsmen, primarily African American with some Puerto Ricans, was ratified in August of 1956 with the type of recognition and ceremony afforded adult statesmen, scaled down for teenage sensibilities. The treaty resulted in a tense and fragile peace that would last for 3 years. Almost immediately, New York City officials under Mayor Robert F. Wagner voiced their disapproval of Myers' methods, including the treaty, which, despite the resulting peace, seemed to give legitimacy to teenage gangs, at least in the view of city officials. The roots of the conflict, addressed by Myers' Lower East Side Neighborhood Association's Peace Treaty of 1956, was a confusing set of promised and broken alliances and eventual enmity between what were initially allied gangs or brother clubs. The two major players in what would become an escalating armed conflict were the Puerto Rican Dragons and the mixed African American and Puerto Rican Sportsmen. Into this volatile situation was another gang, the primarily Jewish youth gang, the Mayros, and a new gang, the Forsyth Street Boys, a mixed gang of mostly Puerto Rican with some African American teens. Initially, the recently formed Forsyth Boys were allied with the Sportsmen against the Dragons, initially. At the negotiation table, overseen by Myers, the opposing factions agreed to terms, one of which was a regulation of how many members of each gang were allowed into certain parts of certain neighborhoods or turf. Permission would need to be obtained if more members from one group were to enter the turf owned by another gang. Many terms of the 1956 Gang Peace Treaty rankled local New York City law enforcement and officials, but it was this point, obtaining permission from gangs for citizens to enter what was supposed to have been public spaces, that Wagner's administration found especially grating, in spite of the resulting peace in the Lower East Side, as tenuous as it was. Still, opposition by the legitimate New York City government doesn't explain how initially two allied brother clubs, the Sportsmen and the Forsyth Street Boys, devolved into bitter enemies, nor does it clarify the roles that other gangs, such as the Mayros and especially the Dragons, played in the series of events that would result in the deaths of 14-year-old Julio Rosario and 15-year-old Teresa G. on the evening of August 23, 1959. Author David Van Pelt, whose research into the background of another, earlier New York youth gang conflict and fatality, the February 1959 gang conflict between the Sand Street Angels and the Mau Mau Chaplains, which also resulted in a gun-related homicide in front of a Flatbush Penny Arcade, formed the basis of his book, Brooklyn Rumble. He gives his insight as to how two allied gangs turned into bitter enemies with tragic consequences.
Michael is researching the death of Teresa G. In the summer of 1959, and her murder happened on August 22. But I'm going to go back a little bit and give you a little bit of the history leading up to her death, and that's one of the questions that Michael was asking about. So the Henry Street settlement was a very important feature in the Lower East Side, and they were on Henry Street, and it was a very well-known and very respected organization that worked with youth in the 1950s. And prior to 1959, they had been working with gang groups for about 15 years. So the situation of Teresa G's death was not something that would be new to them, because they had already been working with gangs for quite a while. Now, In the summer of 1959, they were focused on working specifically with the Dragons. So you have to keep in mind that the Sportsmen were on a different part of the Lower East Side, and although the Henry Street Settlement workers understood and knew about the Sportsmen, the Henry Street Settlement was focused on the Dragons. Now, prior to the Sportsmen and the Dragons having beef, I guess, for lack of a better word, is the Dragons would have quite the battles with a gang called the Mayrows. And the Mayrows were Irish, Italian, and Jewish members. But by October 1956, I believe it was, the Mayrows was pretty much done. And so I'm not sure if that's the reason why, but the Dragons, or the younger Dragons at the time, so they were beginning to turn their attentions from the Mayrows to the Sportsmen. And the Sportsmen lived on Avenue D in the Lillian-Walled houses, or the Lillian-Walled projects, and they were a black gang. And in April 1959, the Henry Street Settlement, Father Myers Church, and the youth boards, we've got 3 different organizations, succeeded in bringing the Dragons and the Sportsmen together for the purposes of allowing the boys to air out their hostilities and find some type of way to end the conflict, because it was pretty vicious. And so an agreement was arrived at, and they agreed in April 1959 that they were going to put a halt to all bopping, which is gang vernacular for gang fights. And so in the meeting, there was a group of 3 Dragons who sat across the table from a group of Sportsmen. And this was in one of the buildings that the Henry Street Settlement had. So it was right on their premises. And in the meeting, the boys heatedly discussed, and they charged each other and countercharged and accused each other for about 2 hours of beating each other up when they walked through each other's neighborhood. And in other words, just causing all kinds of trouble. So for 2 hours, they had this heated discussion. And at the end of the discussion, they come to this agreement that they were going to cool it. And so the truce, this is in April 1959, stated that they could walk through each other's territories unmolested. And it was agreed that they were going to try this for 30 days. Okay? So this was April 21, 1959. 1 month later, on May 22, representatives from the Dragons and the Sportsmen again gathered together around that same table at the Henry Street Settlement. But there was a wrinkle in this new meeting. There was a new group at the table. And this new group was called the Forsyth Boys. And the Forsyth Boys were very angry against the Dragons. They said that the Dragons had invaded their territory and they were looking for trouble. They accused the Dragons of allying with a gang from the Al Smith housing project. And there was so much hostility in this meeting because of the Forsyth Boys being so enraged that their turf was being invaded, that they shouted, and I quote, "We don't want to have a cool with the Dragons." And so the Sportsmen, seeing this, agreed with the Forsyth Boys, and the meeting broke up. So you can see that now we have not just the Dragons and the Sportsmen, but now you have the Forsyth Boys who have now entered this, and they are allied with the Sportsmen because the Sportsmen and the Dragons don't like each other. I know, it's kind of confusing. During the month of June 1959, there was a good deal of small skirmishes that took place between the Sportsmen and the Dragons. This continued until July 1959, when another truce was attempted between the Dragons and the Sportsmen. Unfortunately, this truce fell through. And so now we're getting close to the date of August 22, when Teresa G was tragically murdered. And it was a shock. It was a surprise to the Henry Street settlement that the Forsyth boys were the ones that killed the sportsmen, because traditionally it was the Dragons and the sportsmen who were always at loggerheads. So they were caught off guard by what happened. The Dragons and the Forsyth boys came to an understanding with each other unbeknownst to anybody. They decided amongst the two gangs, the Forsyth boys and the Dragons, that they would no longer bop against each other. There was no reason given in the report, but if I were to hazard a guess, Michael, I would say that the Forsyth boys were Puerto Rican as well as the Dragons. So I don't know if it was the shared ethnicity that did it. That's just a guess. But they decided that they would no longer fight. And now this was unbeknownst to the guys at the Henry Street settlement. The sportsmen catch wind of this. And they're not very happy about this because their allies, the Forsyth boys, are now no longer fighting their mortal enemies, the Dragons. And so the sportsmen get very angry about this. And some of the younger, hot-headed members of the sportsmen began mocking or making fun of Forsyth boys, accusing them of punking out. Just even the word punking out was grounds for a fight. As soon as they started doing that, the relationship between the sportsmen and the Forsyth boys fell apart, and that was the seed that led to Teresa's death.
So it was a perceived or possible betrayal is the root of this.
Yeah, because it seems like that these sportsmen too might have been caught off guards by this new truce or this agreement that the Forsyth boys and Dragons weren't going to fight. And so it sounds like feelings of betrayal probably played into this as well.